this lesson recorded. I'll move that off screen. Okay, so let's recap what we did last week. 1 second, just find my bearings here. I just changed roles at work from being a senior developer to being a technical project manager. So I'm still finding my footing there, but of course it takes a hit on the rest of my life as well, and trying to get things all sorted and organized. I just finished work, like not even 10 minutes ago, so let's see here. Content. Let's take a look at 6. Right, so last week we talked about Node and Express, and we just quickly introduced it. We didn't get that much into it. Like, I can't remember exactly what we covered. Let me pull it open here. Right, so we took a look at blocking versus non-blocking code, and I explained how blocking code is generally everything you do. Almost every single thing you do is generally blocking. The only time that you start having to interact with non-blocking code and having to deal with non-blocking code is on usually I/O things, right? So any input-output type operations. So that can be API requests, that can be user events, that can be working with your file system. Those are things that actually introduce your asynchronous paradigms, where you have to actually overcome that asynchronicity. So we looked at how to deal with that by using things like callbacks is one way to be able to deal with it. Promises is another way, and then async and await, which is the way that we're going to use the majority of the time, is usually generally the best way to deal with that. We have seen a little bit of this when we did React and we were working with Axios and reaching out to APIs with Axios. We saw a little bit of it by using the .then. That's promise-based way to deal with asynchronicity, but async and await just kind of blows all that out of the water and makes your life so much better. So we set up a super simple Node server. We're going to set up another one tonight. We're going to set up another one next week. We're going to keep setting these things up, so you should get pretty used to creating a very simple Node server. We introduced Hopscotch Io. So Hopscotch is a way to be able to create requests to your server without having to go through your internet browser. It's kind of an important step to understand as well, because your internet browser, the way it works is like it loads up and then creates an HTML request, or an HTTP request, I should say, to the endpoint. But usually you kind of control how the user does that, right? So you're the one creating the post request, you're the one creating the get request for that user in order to facilitate that request going to your server. However, when you're testing your API, you may not have a front end, so you want some way to be able to test that. That's where things like Hopscotch or curl or Postman come in, because they allow you to be able to create those requests to that endpoint without needing like a full, HTML website on the front end. That's also one of the reasons that when you guys took PHP, your instructor likely stressed the importance of doing server-side validation, is because of applications like Hopscotch, Postman, and curl. They allow people to be able to make requests without going through your servers. So if you were doing, or without going through your client, which means any client-side validation can be completely circumvented because they'll never encounter it. So that's why you definitely need server-side validation. We talked very little bit about model view controller, about what the differences are between a model, a view, and a controller. Models are for our data logic. They deal with any validation, sanitization, or normalization of data. They also work with the database on being able to store that data. We talked about views a little bit. View is just the presentation element of your data, so it doesn't necessarily have to be HTML. Sometimes it can be XML or JSON or just images or PDFs or whatever. It's just your data in a what's the word I'm looking for? In a formatted way, right? So not even necessarily formatted. It's just the data that you respond with. So in our APIs, we're not going to have an actual view itself, but we will be responding with JSON, so you can consider that as your view. Controllers, they're like the operator. They're the middle person between your views and your models. The controller kind of facilitates handling any information or any request coming in from the view, figuring out what it is that the request is looking for, and then facilitates gaining that information from the model, creating a response, and then responding with that information. So that's the purpose of the controller. It's your business logic. So routing in depth, we didn't cover routing. We're going to cover routing tonight. We're going to take quite a bit of routing. And middleware, we kind of just briefly grazed over. Middleware is basically like little plugged-in operations that we want to do on the request before we finally respond. So when the request comes into our server, we pick it up, we start to process that and build the response, but we can actually pass that request through multiple processes or multiple functions and manipulate it, check it, validate it, do whatever it is that we want to do with it before we finally are ready to build a response and respond with our response. Okay, so that's everything that we covered at a kind of a 30,000 foot view. Tonight we're going to take it down a little bit more nitty gritty and start getting more granular with the stuff that we've learned so far. So we might as well get started. So the good news is there won't be any quizzes or labs tonight, but the bad news is we will definitely have quiz lab next week. So both of those things. We are one quiz in, one lab in. So we need to do 2 more labs and 1 more quiz, I think it is. Or I might have that in reverse. I'll have to double check. But I know we have some more labs to do and some more quizzes to do. The second project will be announced in 2 weeks, which will just be the Node side. And it'll be up to you if you want to connect it to your React side or not, but there will be just a Node API component, basically, that we're going to build. Alright, so if you want to open up the folder where you're keeping your lesson examples, we're going to create a new folder in there. And this is lesson 7. I don't want to capitalize the L. I don't know why I'm capitalizing the L. And I'm going to just double click in there and I'm going to open it in my code editor, or my IDE. And I'm also going to open up my bash shell. So last week we looked at how to initialize a new Node application. It's not too hard. It's pretty simple to do. Does anybody remember how to initialize a Node app? What the command is for that? No? Yeah, init. That's exactly it. So it's npm init, and if you hit enter, it's going to ask you all the questions, like, what's the package name, all that type of stuff. But if you're just doing development and you don't feel like answering all of those questions, what you can do is just npm init -y, and -y will literally just bypass all the questions and initialize it for you. So as you can see, it just stubs it out. There's no real information in there, but we get our node installed. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the package JSON file here inside my IDE, and I'm going to add a new script, and that's just for running our application. I want you guys to get into the habit of doing this. So we're going to call this dev, and the command for it is going to be node mon. So hopefully you have nodemon installed globally. If you don't, you'll have to run npm install nodemon. Nodemon and index.js, because that's the file we're going to create that it's going to execute. So we've run npm init-y in our bash shell. Once it created the package JSON file, we've edited the package JSON file and added a new script called dev, and the only command we're giving it is nodemon index.js. In case you're curious, if you have nodemon installed, you can always type in nodemon in the bash shell with a -v, and it will tell you the version of nodemon running. If it says command not found, then you can run npm install nodemon -d with a capital D, like so, and save it as a developer dependency. But only do this if you don't have it installed. Don't do it if you have it installed, because there's no reason to. It's just redundant. Still with me? So now, in order for us to have our npm application work and we have a server, we're going to install a package that gives us a thin server called Express. Express provides us with the ability to create middleware. It provides us the ability to listen for requests coming in, process those requests, and also provide responses. It also gives us a robust routing service that we can use to be able to create routes to different various functions that we want to execute. So we're going to install Express, but we're also going to install Axios, as we're going to make some API requests tonight. And then we're also going to install cores so that we can test this whole thing inside Hopscotch. So I'm going to do npm install, and we're going to install all three modules at the same time. And the way we do that is by typing in Express, hit space, type in cores, hit space, type in Axios. So by separating them with a space, the installer will automatically know that all three need to be installed. Once you've done that, go ahead and hit enter. And if you already have them kind of in your system, it should go pretty quick. If you don't, then you'll have to wait for them to finish installing. So last week we kind of just wung it, so to speak. So we basically created our index file, and then all of our logic just kind of went into our index file. This week we're going to set up our application like we would if we were to do it, say in some sort of agency that we're working for or whatever. We're going to set it up as a proper application. There's a bunch of different opinions how this should be set up. I'm following kind of this standard MVC method to do this, but other people do it different ways. Like for example, at LMG, we set up our apps quite differently, very differently than the way I'm setting it up here. But then again, at other places I've worked, it's very similar to this. So take it with a grain of salt. All right, so we need our index file. So I'm going to right-click inside this folder here, the lesson 7 folder. I'm going to create a new file called index.js, and that's going to be our entry point file. The next file I'm going to create is the gitignore file, which is .gitignore, and I'll paste that in the chat. I want you to create that file, and inside that file I want you to add the folder node modules. And what that will do is set the node modules folder to be ignored when we go to push our code, so that we don't have to worry about the node modules folder getting pushed. It's a good idea to ignore your node modules folder because no one needs it. When you push your whole repository up there, they don't need the node modules folder, because if they need those modules, they'll just install them by running package install, right? npm install. So we don't need to worry about those modules. So in your gitignore, add the node modules folder. Then we're also going to have a file called routes.js. This is where the routes of our application are going to go. So that's routes.js. Here, I'll zoom in a little. Actually, I'll bring this over because this one does not need to be that big. And I'll zoom in so you can see the sidebar a little better. We're going to create a file called error handling, and that will deal with any error handling that we're going to have. And we're going to use camel case because that's the standard convention. So it's error handling JS. And then we're going to create 3 folders, and you might be like, oh, okay, so model view controller. Well, you're close. We're not going to create a view folder because we're not going to need it. We're going to create a routes folder first, and this is where our resource routes are going to go. Yes, what's up?
How did you create the gitignore folder there? How did you do that?
It's not a folder. I just right-clicked, chose new file, and typed in .gitignore. Like so. That created that file. And then in the file, I added the node modules, just a word, in there.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. So now I have a routes folder. The next folder that I will need is a controllers folder. So I'm going to create a new folder and call it controllers. And that's where all of our business logic is going to go. And then one last folder, and I'm going to call that one models. Though our models tonight are going to be very simplistic. Going forward, we will be using a actual model service called Mongoose, which we'll hook up. But right now, we'll just do it simply. We'll create our own models. So I'm going to go ahead and close all those. And we'll start with our index.js. We're going to create a very simple server, right? Nothing too extravagant. Basically the exact same server we created last week. So I'm first going to create a variable called express, and I'm going to require the express module. This is the same as doing imports in our React applications. I like to put all of my requires at the top of my page. That way I know where to find them. So I'm also going to require cores. Like so. And then I'm going to pull the, I'm going to create an app by calling the express function. And that will instantiate an app for me. And then I'm going to register my first piece of middleware, which is the cores module. And that's now registered, ready to go. I'm almost done. I almost have a working application ready to go. I just need to build the listener. The listener, I'm just going to create a couple of spaces here. I'm going to create my listener of app.listen. And then I have to give it the callback. So the first thing I need to do is give it the port number that I want to listen to, and then the callback that I want to execute. So we're going to get in the habit of doing const port equals, and we're going to say process.env.port or 4000. And the benefit of that is either there's an environment variable, because that's what this means. Process means the thing that's currently running. Environment means the environment it's currently running in. And then port would be a variable that has been defined at that level. These are called environment variables. We're going to have a whole lesson on environment variables next week. But for now, the idea of this is that if the environment has an environment variable called port, it will use that. Otherwise, this or, that's what that means, it will default to using the port 4000, which is fine. Then we just put our port in here, like so. And then we can just do a very basic arrow function saying console.log listening on port, and we'll use some, it would help if we actually used template strings. Listening on port. Like so. So 6 lines of code. Not a lot of code. How can we define the listening interface? What do you mean? This is your listening interface. Oh, to specify on what IP to listen on? I don't know. You'd have to look into the the actual documentation for the app.listen. I know you can define which port to listen on, but the actual IP that it's listening on will automatically be whatever is serving your app, which is usually localhost by default, so 127.0.0.1. If you want to define what your incoming port is, that you would have to look up how to do that. Yeah, sorry, Leo. To be honest with you, I am not a DevOps person. I don't know enough about networking to help you with that. Yeah, we hire DevOps people. By the way, if you guys are into DevOps, it pays well because not enough people are DevOps people. Yeah. All right, so this is going to listen on port 4000. We can actually test this to see if it's working. So I'm just going to clear my shell here, and we're going to run our dev script. Now, the easiest way to run this is just to run npm run dev, and that works for any one of the scripts that we create in here. So if you ran npm run test, it would echo out this error message. But if you run npm run dev, it will execute this expression here. The reason why I created dev and not start was because when we move all this to Heroku, we're going to need to tell it to start using Heroku services. It does it by default, so we don't want to accidentally take it. We don't want to steal it from it. We need to tell it that, you know, it's available. So I'm going to hit npm run dev and hit enter. And we're going to have to allow access. And if everything is working, you should see listening on port 4000. So that's our simple server. We haven't done a lot with it yet. We don't have any routes. We're not really doing much in the way of middleware except for this cores thing. So if anybody comes to this site, like if we were to go to this site in our browser, for example, and I was to go to localhost :4000, like so, we'll just get cannot get slash. Yes?
I got an error message, and it says it couldn't find the file because it's changed.
It couldn't find the index.js file because it's changed?
No, so the app crashed, that's what it says, and then for the file change, the line will start.
Okay, so if the app has crashed, it's either a syntax error of some sort. If it's not a syntax error, then it could be the expression that we're executing here inside of our package.json file. So the package.json file needs to look at...
that part. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you need this line in the package.json file in order for it to execute. What's your error, Stella? Sorry?
Seems mine is the same, sorry. Yeah, seems mine is the same. Sorry.
Do you have this comma after test?
Yes.
Okay, so if all that is the same, then as long as this code is the same, it should execute. I'll copy and paste it inside the chat window. And then if that code is not working, then there might be a different problem. We may have missed the step where we installed Express, Cores, and Axios.
Okay, now it seems fine. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I think it was the .net .js something out there that was wrong. So I copied and pasted your code.
Okay. Stella, what's your issue? What's the error you're getting? Thanks, Leo. That's actually very helpful. I'm going to look at that. Stella, what was your issue? You're getting an error?
Yeah, it also says app crashed, but I copied like your code from the chat after it crashed the first time, and then I reran it, and it's still saying that.
Okay, so let's just, again, make sure we have the different pieces we need. So in package.json, you need to have this dev script here.
Yeah, I have that.
Okay, and then just kill your app, like go Control-C. And actually, sorry, one more thing. In the package.json file, under dependencies, you should have Axios, Cores, and Express.
Yep.
You have all three of those?
Yeah, they're all there.
Okay. And you're getting app crashed. Huh. Is there any more information than just app crashed? Can you copy what it says in your current shell window and just paste it in the chat? Oh, it's because your address 4000 is already in use. Do you have more than one server running right now? Like, have you executed this application more than once?
I tried to cancel it with Control C and then restart it, but that's it.
You may have, it's called an orphaned process. You may have an orphaned process, which means it's currently holding on to the port 4000 and won't release it. So what I would recommend doing, Stella, is just change from port 4000 in your code to port 5000 and try it again.
Okay, now it's still working.
Yeah. So
Thanks.
no worries. So that is one thing to note, that when you kill a process, it can actually create an orphan process or create something called a zombie process. And essentially what that is, it's a process that's still running but isn't attached to anything anymore. And the only way to get rid of it is by finding the actual process ID and then manually killing it, either through the command line prompt, or if you're in Windows, I think you might even be able to do it through the task manager. Actually go through the task manager, find that process, and then kill it through that process. But for now, Stella, just leave it at port 5000 and we'll deal with it that way. Alright, so next thing we need to do is actually create our error handler. So we're going to leave this in place. We're not going to actually create any routes yet. We're going to start with our error handler first. So I'd like you guys to open up the error handling JS file. And so this we're going to export. Just like we export things in React, whenever we create a component, we export our component out of React. We're going to export out these different methods. But instead of doing exports.default, we're actually going to give our export a name. So the name we're going to give our exports, so it's called exports. It's important, don't forget that S. It's not export, it's exports. .handle 404s is the first one we're going to create, and that will be an arrow function. And then we're going to create one more called error handler, and it will also be an arrow function. So we're going to have one that handles 404s and then one that just handles any kind of error that we have. This will give us custom error handling within our application. So when it comes to creating methods that deal with requests, these are actually pieces of middleware that we're creating. So a request will process through this middleware, and then we can actually perform actions based on what has happened with that request. However, we're going to do these somewhat differently. So the first thing I want to do with my middleware here is I want to make sure that hold on, what did I do there? Sorry, I'm just reviewing my own code here. Oh, you see, I wrote this wrong already. We need to wrap both of those in a set of parentheses. Why did I do that? No, you don't. Never mind. Don't do that. That's crappy code that Sean wrote inside the notes for whatever reason. Not sure why I did that. So generally when we create these little middlewares, we take in up to 3 arguments, right? So we have the request, the response, and the next, right? So remember, the request is an object that is created by Express. It basically takes the request coming in, the HTTP request coming in, converts it into an object, fills it out so that you have all the information like your headers, how the request was made, any information about the refer, any of that type of stuff is all a part of that request body. Then there's the response. The response is the object that you work with in order to build a response and send it back to the user. And generally that will contain things like the HTML that you want to send back. It might have functionality built into it too, like local variables or rendering engines that you have attached, or the methodology that you want to send back in, whether it's JSON or raw text or whatever it is, right? So that's the response object. And then the last one is the next object. And what the next object's purpose is it basically says, I'm done processing this request, but we're not ready to send a response yet. I want to pass this request on to the next middleware. So what it does is you call next, and it literally pushes your request off to the next middleware. So that's what we're going to do. We don't need a request and a response here. So we can actually supplement them with underscores instead of actually typing out request and response, because we're not going to use them. We shouldn't actually define those variables unless we're going to use them. Then we can use next. Actually, I think we have to do 2 underscores here. We can't do 1. 1 underscore for the first one, 2 for the second one. Otherwise, we wind up with a conflict. And then next. So I will copy and paste this because underscores are one of the things that everybody tends to mess up. So all our 404 is going to do is basically create a custom 404 error. That's all it's going to do. Not very elaborate. So we're going to create const error equals, and it's just going to be an object. And then we're going to return, or sorry, process that error object by calling next on it. And that's going to pass it on to the next thing. Inside our object, we're going to just create a few little pieces. We're going to give it a status code. And we'll make the status code 404. We'll give it a message, resource not found. And we'll give it a status of not found. Like so. So this will be for our 404s. We'll create a 404, we'll throw an error, and we'll literally pass this error into our 404. Then our error handler, which is here, we are actually going to use the response, but we don't need the request. However, we're going to add a 4th argument this time. We start with error. We supplement the request with an underscore because we don't need to access it. We're going to give it a response, but I'm going to use the short form of res instead of typing out the full word. And then we're going to pass the next object as well. This is super important syntax inside Express. It tells Express that this is an error handler. That's its purpose. If it contains these 4 arguments, that is the error handler. And as far as I know, you can only have 1 defined, or you should only have 1 defined, because it will be the thing that when you pass next through that actually deals with your errors. So we're going to just check the status. We're going to say res.status, and we're going to set it to the error. So we're taking in this error message here, which you can use this kind of as context of what the error will look like. We're taking in the error message. We're setting the status code, like so. Or we're going to default and set the error to 500, which means it's a server error. Then we're going to return a JSON response. So just like the responses we created last week, similar thing. So I'll copy this 404 so that you guys have it. That way I can scroll down a little bit. So in here we're going to set our status code. And the status code will be error.statuscode. We could actually just make this equal to the body and then, yeah. We could definitely flatten this, but we're not going to. The status will be error.status or will be failed. The message, which usually comes back with any errors that come through, will be error.message. In the scenario of our 404, there won't, well, I guess there is a message actually. It's resource not found. When we throw an error in JavaScript, it always returns back a message. And then we'll send back the stack trace as well, because I imagine you guys will use this in your projects. And then we'll destructure anything else that may happen to be in the error message. So if we're missing anything in the error, we can actually send it back as well. And then we're ready to do next, which we have to call. So even though we're responding, we still have to call next here so that our application finishes with that request. I'm actually curious if that's true or not. Doesn't seem like it makes sense to me, because it's either usually you respond or you call next. It's not usually you do both. But this is what's in their syntax for the examples. All right, so I will copy and share that. Now, right now, these are just exported functions. That's all they are. They aren't actually a part of our application. We have to import them into our application and then work with them. So I'm just going to widen my screen a little bit here, split it, leave the error handling over here, and open index.js on the left-hand side. I'm also going to collapse my sidebar. That way you guys can see both sets of code. Like I said before, I like to make sure that all of my imports are at the top of my file. So I'm going to import these, but because they're named, I can actually import them as named named modules, right? Just like we would in React. So I'm going to do handle 404s, like so, and error handler, like so, equals require, and that would be the error handling, like that. And this is my custom import for my error handler. Error handling needs to be the last thing that our application goes through. Let's say last argument, last middleware. So it has to be the last middleware before we set up our listener. So we're going to say app.use handle 404s and app.use error handler. And actually that's not a function call. I don't know why it turned itself into a function call. It's just the actual piece itself. So essentially what's going to happen is the user comes to the page. If they can't access the page, we should be returning back a 404, but we'll do that within our routing. So our routing will actually look for the page that they're trying to access. If they can't find it, then we're going to return back a 404 to our user. Right now, all we've done is set up our app and got it ready to go. If we actually execute, this didn't come with it, if we actually execute our application and run it, just going to get nothing except for port 4000 because we're not actually doing anything yet. And if you were to navigate it to it inside your browser, you're still just going to get the cannot, right? Actually, you'll get the not found is what you'll get. Oops. So you'll get this not found message because that's what's getting passed by our error handler.
Sean, did you just open that in your browser?
Yeah, just localhost 4000 in my browser.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. All right, so we'll take a break there for a minute. And when we come back, we'll take a look at adding in a page controller and a routing system. We'll take a break till, let's say, 4 o'clock. And then we'll start again at 4 o'clock. And then if we need a break later on, we'll just take a little one. All right? Cool. I'm going to pause this thing. Okie doke, and we're back. Okay, so we have our error handling in place. We've got it implemented into our application. We're good to go, and if you got it working correctly, you should be able to navigate to localhost :4000 and see it. Incidentally, just to get kind of ready for it, I'm going to open up my localhost page here, and I'm going to navigate to Hopscotch Io. And it doesn't require a login or anything. I'm going to copy and paste that. There we go. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit, just so you guys can see it a little better than it is. There we go. The only thing I hate about the way it does this is it kind of blocks off with this stupid page. I don't know if there's a... Oh, there we go. That's better. Actually, that's much better. I like that. Okay, so I'm going to do this as a get, not a post. So I'm going to change my method to get. The URL that I'm pointing at is just going to be localhost :4000. That's all. Like so. Oh, it says it found a new update. Okay. Anyways, I'm going to click send. And we should get our error code. So this is not like a 404 like would happen if we didn't have the page. This is a 404 that we're sending from our application. So you should be able to see that through this particular send. So again, that's just changing the method to get, putting your URL in, clicking send, and then seeing the JSON response. Cool? Cool, cool, cool. All right, let's see what we're up to next. Okay, so we're going to talk about pages, controller, and route. So to better understand the structure of our application, right, we're going to build a very simple pages resource. And the whole idea of the pages resource is just basically to deliver some documentation about our API. That's all it's going to do. So the resource isn't going to have a model, even though I'm calling it a resource, and you'll often hear me correlate resources with models. This particular resource will not have a model, okay? But it will have a controller, and it will have a set of routes. So you'll remember that we did build a view system. No, we did not, so ignore that line. For now, we're just going to stick with the controller passing the data in an unformatted view. So we're just going to return JSON back, basically a JSON structure of the documentation. So before we can define a route, we'll need a controller, and the idea is that the client will request the route will then invoke the controller, and then lastly, the controller will respond back to the client. So it looks like this. So the client makes a request by typing in an address inside the address bar, right? Makes that request. That request goes to our server, which hands it off to our router. Our router takes a look at the pattern of this request and defines what it's looking for. So incidentally, this particular lesson plan system that I use is also built using MVC. It's using the Rails framework, and it works similarly to what we're building. So course lesson plans is the resource. I have several course lesson plans in my database, and I want to access the 105th lesson plan, which is crazy that I've made that many, but I have. So course lesson plans and 105th lesson plan, right? So this information goes to the router, and that's important because if we just sent it to like a regular server, it wouldn't really know what we were looking for. Like if we sent this to an Apache server, it would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Unless we built some logic into Apache in order for it to properly read this and know where to send this information off to. So that's where our express routing comes into play. It's going to look at this and it's going to look for, okay, do I have a route called /course lesson plans? Oh, look there, I do. And do I have either a route that matches this identifier or a placeholder that matches that identifier? No different than what we did in React. So it's going to be like, yep, I've got it. It's going to go gather all the information, compile a view in this scenario, and send it back. So the client goes to the router. The router is then going to send off this request to the controller. So in this particular scenario, the controller will be the course lesson plan controller. It's going to send it off to the course lesson plan, the controller. It's going to go and grab all the data it needs. Usually when you're dealing with resource routing, it's going to go to the course lesson plan model and retrieve all the course lesson plans that match this identifier of 105. It's going to compile what it needs in data, and then it's going to send that back to the view. So there is a piece here that's missing. There's a view piece, but we don't have that in ours. The view will then be fired off to the client. So client takes this URL, passes it to the route. The route takes this URL, figures out which controller action to fire off, passes whatever data needs to be sent to the controller, and then the controller mangles it all up, turns it into a view, and sends that back to the client. And that just keeps happening over and over again. So it's best to break up your controllers into individual actions. So often when you see these kind of express systems, a lot of people just build these massive router files and they have all these different routes in it, and it's kind of, it's a little bit much to actually try to maintain. It's much better to break your information up based on what it's doing, right? So based on its overall function. So usually what happens is you're going to break up your routes into individual resource routes. So this route's for users, this route's for handling, reservations, this route's for handling emails, this route's for handling blah, blah, blah. Whatever the actual thing is that it's doing is what you're breaking your routes into. And then those routes will point to a singular controller file. So that resource routing will point to one controller file. So for example, if it's users, the users will point to a controller file called users controller. And then in the users controller, you break down the actions that you want to execute based on those routes. So in the routes file, you'll have like 7 routes, for example. So you'll have 4 get routes, one that points to retrieving all of a resource, one that points to getting only the first resource, one that points to being able to create a new resource, or one that wants to be able to edit a resource. So you guys did that in PHP, right? It's called CRUD. You created those views in your PHP. And then you'll have your post ones as well, your post routes for creating, updating, and destroying. So generally, in this class at least, and actually even out in the real world when you start working in the industry, you're going to wind up creating some variation of these 7 routes all the time for every single resource. You might have other routes that provide extra functionality or do perhaps other formatting or something like that. But for the most part, these 7 routes will be very common, regardless of the MVC that you're working in. So we're going to follow this same kind of pattern. We're going to build the 7 route pattern, but we're going to do this in our... right now we're going to work with pages, so we don't actually have a resource. So we don't need a new, we don't need an edit, we don't need a create, update, or destroy. We don't even need a show, really. We just need an index page, so to speak. So let's create our first controller. So I'm going to close off these guys here. We will come back to the index page. But for right now, we're just going to create our controller. So in our controllers folder, we're going to right click and choose to create a new file. And we're going to call it pages.js, or if you want to, you can call it your pagescontroller.js. It's totally up to you. I just assume it's a controller because it's under the controller folder. Sometimes people like to explicitly, depending on the MVC you're working with, some of them like to explicitly define it's a controller. And just like we created that exports before, we're going to create an exports in here as well. And the exports is actually named. It's a named export, and we name it after the route that we want to perform. So we're going to create a route called documentation, or doc, and we're going to create an exports called documentation, or we can just call it doc. That also works. It's going to take a request and a response, like so. And this is going to return a very simple response. Now, because we're not actually using the request, we could get rid of it. We can replace it with an underscore, right? Because we're not actually going to reference it. This is common convention in JavaScript. So let's write our response. So our response will be response. And I always like to put a status when we're dealing with JSON. So I'm going to do a 200, meaning this is a success. You successfully reached this page. .json. And this JSON is going to return our documentation. Our documentation is just going to be an array of routes that are available that they can access with their API. And I'm going to split those apart. So this is just going to convert this array of objects that I'm going to put in here into JSON and then send that back to the user when they access this path, when they access the /doc path, which will probably just turn into our home route. We'll create 2 routes for it. So we're going to need an object in here, and in our object, it's going to contain 2 properties. One will be called path, which will be the route that we want people to be able to access. So we're going to say the route is called characters. And then the description, and this is like any type of API documentation that you would create, should describe what it actually does. This returns the first 100 characters in the database. So that's what that route will do. And then we're going to have another route. And this one will have the path of /characters. And it's going to have a placeholder in it called starts with name. And the whole purpose of that placeholder will be able to allow them to navigate to characters, but then create like a search for a specific person. So the description will be returns a list of characters whose name start, or whose names, name or names? Start with, starts with name. Value. It's kind of a mouthful. It's a rather lengthy description. And then we're also going to have a third thing, path, and it's going to actually allow you to be able to select a character by its specific identifier. So each of these characters has an ID, and we'll be able to pull them back with a specific ID. So again, it's a description, returns the character with the specified ID. So let's walk through this again. We are exporting a new module called doc, which is going to wind up being a middleware, right? It takes in the response, the request and the response, but we've replaced request with an underscore because we're not referencing it anywhere. In the response, we're returning our status and then chaining on our response called JSON. That response is returning back an array of objects. And in that array of objects, all we're doing is basically describing each one of the routes that are available in our API. These are not actually clickable actions. All it's going to do is literally return this list of objects. That's it. Nothing too extravagant. The one thing I like about this class is you get to kind of see under the hood how a lot of these systems work that you're going to be working with out in the real world. Like if you're working with things like Laravel or Ruby on Rails, for example, or C# MVC, this helps kind of expose what actually occurs underneath the hood, how all this kind of connects together. All right, so hopefully you've got those in place. It's copied and pasted in the chat for you. Our next step after we have our controller defined is we need to actually create the route for this specific controller. So we need some place to put the routes so that we have the routes for this page. So to define routes, we're going to define it in the routes folder. Yes, I know we've got this routes.js file. That's going to be our composer file, which its whole purpose is to basically compose all of the routes and load them all at once for us. But individual resource routes we're going to put under this routes directory. Sorry, I had to mute for a second. I was about to sneeze. All right, so under routes, I'm going to right-click and choose New File. And I'm going to name my route file the same name I gave my controller file. So it's called Pages. And all of our route files are going to automatically import our controller actions. So these things that we define with exports doc, I'm going to call them actions. So this is a controller action, your doc action, so to speak. So we're going to import those actions. So it's just called doc. And it's going to require us to move up in our chain, go to controllers, go to pages. This export works more like the default exports that we do in React. So this one is not like a named export where we actually provided an export name. This is like a default export. So whatever we assign it just automatically gets exported out. So this one we activate by doing module.exports, and then we make it equal to the function we want to export. I don't want the word function there. So this is going to have an argument. This argument is going to be router, because we're going to actually pass this export the router that we instantiate on our index page. And then we define our routes that we want to access. So the first route we're going to do is /, which is our home path. And we're going to point it at doc. So if you remember how we were defining routes last week, when we defined a route, So we kind of did it this way. We did app.post or app.get, right? And then we do a slash, and then we'd have our function call, right? And then inside our function call, we had request, response, and next. And then inside here, we had our logic, right? So that's essentially what we're doing here. It's exactly the same thing, only instead of creating this whole function in here, we're actually passing the function that we defined in our controller page. So hopefully that makes sense. This is the function, the callback that we've defined, and we're passing it to this route instead of explicitly defining it in here. So don't write the app.get thing. We only need this one. The cool thing about that is it allows us to be able to create aliases. So I can do another route that points to doc and point it at the exact same function. And then when I'm done, I just have to remember to return the router. So what these routes pages are going to do is they're essentially going to build all of our routes for us. We're going to take all of those routes and register them with our application, and then our application starts listening, and all of those routes become patterns that we recognize against as the user makes request. So if the user goes to /doc, it will match this route right here, and we will execute this function. That's how it will work. Right now, nothing works. We have a pages controller, we have a routes pages, but we have nothing connected up to our actual application yet. We still need to actually connect it. Any questions so far? This stuff can get pretty confusing pretty fast. We'll go through it again once we're done here. So the last thing we need to do is actually import and pass our global router so the new pages routes can be added to our application. So this composition file down here must register each of the resource routes for us. So I'm just going to dock this one over to the side here. I'm going to open this file here and close this off so that you can see this here if you're still typing it out. Actually, I'll just copy and paste it into the chat channel. So this is in routes pages.js. Make sure you don't put this in the controllers. This goes in the routes. And now we're ready to create our composition. There are better ways to do this, and I have written better ways to do this. However, they're quite convoluted. But if you want to write this in a different way that you feel would be better, then you go for it. I'm just going to expand this past my file over here so that we're not collapsing like that. Okay, so what essentially is happening now is I'm requiring this, but instead of requiring it and storing it in a variable, which I could do, right? I could create a variable up here called pages, make it equal to this require, like so. So there's my require, and then call pages and pass in this router, and then return the router when I'm done. I could go through that process, but because it's just extra work, and for every resource I would have to do this, it's much easier for me just to require and execute at the exact same time. So this execution, the require itself happens first, it loads it in, and then now we're passing in the router field to it as an argument, almost literally as if we copied the function and pasted it in place right here. That's the equivalence. Routes.pages? What do you mean routes.pages? Question mark, question mark. It is routes/pages. Did I write routes.pages somewhere? Oh, I did write routes.pages. Context, Leo. I have no idea what you're talking about. Takes me at least a good couple of seconds to realize where we're looking. right, so when we require, we're importing the exported structure. So you're literally importing this function. Just ignore this stuff here. You're importing this function. That's what winds up getting stuck here. And then we're executing the function, passing in the router argument. We're almost done. We have one other thing to do, and that's actually take our routes composition file and add it to our index page. So I'm going to put it over here. I'm going to hit Control P on my keyboard and type in the word index, and it's going to show me the index file here, and I'm going to hit enter. Or I can go to the sidebar and load it this way, but I mean, why not do it the easy way? So once again, that was Control P. I type in the name of the file, or even just a few characters of the file, and I can find my file and quickly access it. So we need to load our routes, and that has to happen after the cores. So load our routes. So the first thing we're going to do is actually get our routes. So we're going to say const routes equals require, and this is just the root routes. So the ones at the root level of our application. Then I'm going to create a router. So equals routes, and I'm going to pass it the express.router. And that's actually what's filling in everywhere you see this word router in our routes or in our pages.routes right here. That is that router. It's this guy right here. That's what's filling in that spot. We're carrying it around through our application, and it's going, and we're adding routes here, and we're adding routes there to it. And then when we're done all that, because it is blocking, we register those routes with our application as a middleware. So you're going to add this chunk of logic just underneath the app.use core. I'll give you a second to catch up. All right, so let's talk about what's happening. Step one, we created a controller. In our controller, we are exporting a module, right? But I like to call these actions. We're exporting an action called doc. Our doc action can take up to 3 arguments. It can take the request, which we're not using, so we just underscored it. It can take a response, and it can also take the next object, which we could use to fire off to something else. We've set a status, right, which is a good idea whenever you're building an API to define a status so people know what's happening. So you set a status, and then we have a JSON response here that we've created. Our JSON response is an array, and inside the array is just this pieces of information. The contents of this array are completely unimportant to our application. They don't provide any functionality whatsoever. All we're doing with these is giving information to somebody using our API on what paths are going to be available. We haven't even implemented these paths yet. So don't get hung up on the content inside the JSON structure. It's irrelevant. It's just there for our API piece. So our pages controller, we have one action called doc. Our next step was to create a routes. So our routes.js, sorry, that's the wrong one. Our pages.routes, that's our next step. So here's pages.routes, or sorry, routes/pages. That's why I did it, Leo, because I keep saying it for some reason.
In here, we're importing our doc action, right, from our controller's pages. And then we're exporting out a new module, a default module. That's what this basically means. We're exporting out a default module. We're passing a router argument. And inside that router, we're defining 2 routes to listen to. So if the user goes to our home page, this route will get triggered and will execute that action that we defined in our controller. If they go to /doc, then we're going to execute the same action. This is known as an alias route. An alias route is where a route points to the same content but has a different path, right? And then we return our router. This is our resource route, meaning that it is resource specific. All the routes we define in here are resource specific. They're specific to our pages controller. The routes.js file is our composition file. It will actually take all of the routes we define and load them up. So that every time we get a new resource, we just add it into this spot, and it will automatically get assigned to the router object, the express router object for us. We're almost done. In our index.js page, this is where all that magic comes together. We take that routes composition file, we pass it the express router, which is the thing that actually allows us to define routes, and then it returns back this wonderful object that we can then use as a chunk of middleware, which will be used to listen to the paths that the users are bringing in. I know it seems weird that we're doing it in this order, but the reason why I do it in that order is because you don't wind up with errors when you do it in that order. Right? This is broken. Look at how broken that is. Whew, is that ever broken? Because the actual pathway would be when the user comes to the app, they're going to hit our listener. Our listener is going to look at the registered routes. It's going to go into here, find out what route matches it by figuring out which one of the loaded routes we have is the correct set. Go in here, find the correct path. So we'll say this is the path. It's going to execute this action, which is under here. And this is going to return this wonderful JSON object to us. Let's go ahead and test this. If we go to our Hopscotch or even to your browser, either one will work. And we just load in the localhost 4000 that we're currently getting this 404 error on, and click and send, you should see your JSON object. If you do it in your browser, you should get the same. So either one of those is fine. I would get in the habit of using Hopscotch, but you can use the localhost one. You won't be able to use your browser when we start doing post requests. Those will have to be done through Hopscotch. Cool? So you've built your first API endpoint. That's what I would call it. If you were working with me, I would tell you to build an API endpoint, and that's what you would do. You would go through that process to build your API endpoint. So you now have your first public, because it's a public accessible endpoint. Well, public if somebody's using your machine, but if you were to deploy this to Heroku, it would be public. Yeah, of course. So when we're done, I'll push it all up and then I can share it. Yep, no problem. All right. Our next step. Our cool next step. So normally I have a break here, but I think we might as well just power through and end slightly early. I like ending early. I'm sure you guys like ending early too. All right. The characters model, the controller, and the routes. So like I said, we're going to build a model tonight. This model, I built it last semester, and it was fine. I just think it kind of confused some things because during a lot of the projects that I received for the Node side of my course, they kept copying this model for some reason. It's very, very important to understand that a model doesn't necessarily have to be married to something like Mongoose or TypeORM or what's the other big one? Book, or any of those other ORMs that exist out there, you can just build your own models. People do it all the time, or they call them entities. Some people call them entities. You can just do that. That's totally fine, and that's what we're going to do tonight. That's what the example is that you can build your own model. A model's purpose is just to be an access point between your application and your database, and to facilitate that transfer of data, as well as doing any validation, normalization, or sanitization that needs to happen. You don't need an ORM or an ODM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper, or Object Data Mapper. Those tend to come with a bunch of opinions. They also tend to come with a bunch of helpful utilities, like a query language that they provide you in order for you to be able to query your database or your data properly. Object builders, where they actually convert your data to a proper object, and then you can utilize that as an object. Helpful instance methods, helpful static methods, things like that. They give you a lot of abilities to be able to do a lot of cool things. But tonight we're going to build something very simple. So the next resource we're going to create for our application is a character lookup. We're going to have 3 routes, 3 controller actions, just like we defined in our JSON structure there when we were talking about it. Here we go. So these 3 paths are what we're going to have. The model will retrieve our data for us and provide us a way to interact with the data. And then in our next lesson, we're going to look at creating our own data store. But for tonight, we're going to just create this data store. Now, this connects to an API that I have set up that connects to another API. An actual rather fun API. I just haven't given it away yet. But the reason why you're going through a middle party, which is my middle party, is because the other API requires you to have a token. And I didn't want you guys to all have to register for tokens. So I just created a nice little middleware between that one and us so that you guys can go through there. All right, so we are going to create our model, because we need our model first before we create our controller. Again, it's always this process of working backwards, right? The model needs to exist, then the controller can access the model, then the route can access the controller, then the route's composition file can access those routes, the resource routes. It's just always in that kind of succession. All right. So in our, we'll collapse all these. In our models, we're going to create a new file, and it's going to be called character, no S, character.js. Okay. This is going to be our model, and our model, like I said, is going to handle everything to do with our data. Now, we're not connecting to a database. Instead, we're going to connect to an API. But again, we're going to put this onus on the model, okay? Not our controller. Whoops, typing in the wrong location. So the first thing I'm going to do is import Axios, because that will be our data access helper. And the model cares about that. Nothing else cares about that. Then we're going to create a base path. So this time I'm going to actually call this base path all in capital letters. And I will give you the address here. Oh, you see, this is always such a pain. Hold on. When I built my application to do lesson plan building, I made it so that I could drag and drop the sections so I could organize them, but now I can't select anything. Alright, unless I go into my static view, which is what you guys get. So that's the URL. And it probably also gives away what we're actually accessing. So the first model helper that we're going to create, or instance method we're going to create, is called find. So just like we do with the controller, we're going to create this like an action.
and it's an async function, and I think this might be, no, I think we've written one async function so far. The reason why it's an async function is because what we're about to do with Axios is technically an I/O operation. It's an input-output operation, right? Because it's an I/O operation, we need to be able to wait for it to complete its operation before we do anything with the data. So by using async, that gives us the ability to use a wait, which allows us to retrieve back the information and then process it however we choose. So let's create the path that we're going to access from our endpoint. We'll make it a template string. So we'll put the base path in here like so. And it will access the character's endpoint. After that, we'll do our call for Axios. So we'll do a wait Axios, and we'll provide it the path. Axios by default does a get request. If you want it to post, you have to actually explicitly tell it to post. And we'll store this in a destructured variable called data. So Axios will return back a response. One of the properties of the response is called data. We're destructuring data into the variable. Now we want to format this so we can actually get the thumbnail from it. Or do we? You know what? We're not going to do that actually. We're just going to return the data. I think it was because originally I had a whole front end for this that I provided. I'm not going to do that just for the argument of time. So in the above code, we're requiring Axios, which will allow us to make requests to external APIs, right? So the Marvel API wrapper.herokuapp.com is an external API. So we used this same thing last week when we used the Chuck Norris API, right? We just accessed using Axios, reached out, grabbed our data, and brought it back. The next line, we're defining a constant to store the base path to the Marvel API I've created in Heroku. And it's best to define a base path as all the routes for the API use the same scheme, domain, and initial path. So this essential base path is going to be used by all of our calls that we do inside our model. So after we've required Axios and defined a path, we're going to create some methods in our model, right? To make accessing the data considerably easier. So the whole idea of our model is to kind of allow us to be able to deal with validation, sanitization, normalization, but also helps us to be able to create instance methods that allow us to be able to access data easier. The first method, which is our find method, will return a list of Marvel characters, the first 100 from their database. Ideally, it would return all of them, but we'll settle for 100 for now. Notice we define our complete base path, right? So we've defined this whole path, which is the endpoint to the Marvel API that we want to hit. So now there might be a way to do offsets, but I didn't expose those endpoints in my Marvel API wrapper. We're using an async function, which gives us the ability to use a wait, right? So that means because this is an asynchronous operation, instead of having to do a callback, we can actually use a wait and wait for this data and then process it as we choose to. Makes it like an absolute breeze to work with, for sure. All right, before we return the data, blah, 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 never mind, because that's not important. Now we're ready to actually add the controller action for this particular endpoint. I was going to make all of the endpoints in the model, but I think it's better that we do them one at a time. It just makes things a little bit clearer. So this is our character in our model. I'll copy that code and provide it to you. There you go. Now I'm going to jump to the controller, but I'm going to leave the character model open here on the right, and I'm going to hit Control P. I'm going to type in controllers like so, / Oh, right, I don't have a characters controller yet. We need to create one. So under the controllers, I'm going to right-click, choose New File, and create a characters.js file. So that will be under controllers, characters.js. So the first thing we do when we're working with a resource that has a model is we require the model. And I like to name the resource with capital letters so that I know it's the model that I'm working with. It makes it easier, plus it tends to be common convention. So we're going to go to Models and Character. So that brings in my character model. Now I can write the action in my controller that I want to execute. And if we look at the actions table that I talked about before, if I want all of a resource, it's an index action I want to perform. So I'm going to name my action index. And I'm going to make it async because the model actions are asynchronous. And I want to be able to access those using async and await and not have to do .thens. Inside here, I'm going to get my response and my next. And you'll see why in a second. Now, because we're using async and wait and we don't have that catch option that just normally comes with promises, we need to actually write our own try catch. I like to write them on one line like so. And then I split my cursors by holding my Alt key down so I have two cursors and I hit enter, which creates the block. Our catch are always going to be the same. It's just going to be next and error. And then that will fire off, if we get an error, off to our error handler. And our error handler will deal with it. Any of our actual controller action logic will go in the try block. Just for those of you that don't know, that's the try block. One thing to note, try blocks are scoped. So if you have a variable that you define in here and try to access outside of the try block, you won't be able to because they are scoped within the try block. Which you're probably like, duh, yeah, I know. But if you're dealing with like PHP, you might have gotten confused about that. Alright, let's create a variable called characters. And it's literally going to hold all of the characters from our data. So I'm going to do an await character, the name of my model with a dot, find. And that's it. I'm not going to pass it any other details. And then I'm going to return a status of 200 with the JSON of all the characters. Just like so. Super simple index. So let's walk through this while you're going ahead and typing it. So I've imported my model. This is my model over here, right? This code that you see in here is what's getting imported into character. Character, with the capital C, is currently this function's value. I have created a new index action called index, or sorry, a new action called index underneath my characters controller. It's an async operation, so I can use async and await, and I don't have to do any funny things in order to deal with the fact that it's an asynchronous operation. I want to grab all the characters, so I'm calling await character.find, which is calling this method here, right? It's calling this find method here. So it's creating the base path, it's sending off an Axios request, getting the data back, and returning the data back to me. So characters is now the same as data. These two are correlated to each other, right?
Then I return a response of 200 with those characters. If an error happens in the model, or if an error happens inside the controller, I'm going to catch it and then respond with a next error, which will go through my error handler and output our error using our error handler. Cool? Still with me? Quite a bit to definitely wrap your head around. But that being said, though, the more we do this, the more you'll get used to it, right? All right, I'm going to move the characters array over here. And we're going to create a new route file called characters.js. And in here, we're just going to do the same thing we did in the last one. We're going to import our controller. And we only really care about the index action right now. We don't have any other actions, so we'll import the index action. We'll write our module's export function, which will export the router. And we're going to listen to the router/characters for that route. So if they go to /characters, we will execute our index action. And we'll return our router. So we're importing the index action, which is really just this function from our controller, right? It's the same function. We're creating a new route that listens to the /characters path. So localhost :4000 /characters. And if that gets found, it will call this index, which is really just executing this action. And then we return our router. So our last step that we need to deal with is actually adding this resource to our resource routes. The good thing is we're going to have 3 routes inside our resource route here, but in our composition we only need to add the 1 line and then we're done. We don't need to do anything else with our composition file. So our composition already exists. It's just called routes.js. So I'm just going to hit Control-P, do a search for routes.js, and open it up. And I can even get, sneaky and lazy and just hit Alt-Shift next to this line and press down, which will create a duplicate. And then change this from .routes to .routes/characters, like so. And now our routes are actually a part of our system. Oh, isn't that funny? I wrote the thing and then I didn't copy and paste the code. Sorry about that, guys. There you go. That's for the characters routes. All right, I want to test this, so I'm just going to dock this over here. So that's that routes module, and I'm going to grab my browser and navigate to Hopscotch, and I'm going to go to /characters, and if everything is working, I should get 100 characters. So I just did a send, and there we go. I've got 3D Man, A-Bomb, AIM, Aaron Stack, Abomination. I've got 100 of my characters already. So now we can go ahead and add more routes. We don't need our routes composition anymore because this is a resource route, right? And it's already bringing in our resource for us, which is right here. So we already have this resource. So all we need to do is just add new paths to our resource route. And then this will automatically get loaded in the composition routes. So we can close off the composition route file. We'll still need our controller open. We'll still need our model open. And we'll still need the routes open. So let's organize this into the order it goes in. So this is the model. This is the controller, and then this is our routes. So we're going to do the model function, then our controller action, and then our route. And we'll just keep doing that, and then we'll keep testing in Hopscotch. Dealio, Emilio? Alrighty. So our next step is the show action. This is going to work by taking a chunk of the character's name and then returning the character when they match that particular path. Sorry, it's the search action, actually. No, I want the show action. We're going to do the ID one first, so we'll do the show action. So we're going to call this exports.show equals async. It's going to be an async operation as well, just like the last one. We'll define the path. And the path is going to have that base path in it. It's going to go to characters, and it's going to go to ID. So we're going to need to get the ID from somewhere. So instead of this just being an empty argument here, we're going to take in an ID as the parameter, or as the argument. Sorry, empty parameter will receive an ID argument. Let's try to say these correctly. And we're going to get our data back. So we're just going to do data equals await Axios path. But I want to manipulate this data a little bit. The data comes back as an array, but I only want the singular person. So I'm going to do structure the data out like that. And then I'm going to return that data. So that will return a single record based on the ID, and you can just get the ID from your list. There's like all these different people in here. So for example, there's Adam Destine. I don't know who that is. I know who Adam Warlock is though. So I can copy that ID, just leave it in my copy for now. So if I was to try this path right now, it's not going to work, right? Like if I go to /characters/ and paste that ID in and hit enter, I get a 404 not found because we haven't registered the path yet with our routes. So we still need our controller action as well. So I'll copy this model function for you. There you go. And we can go ahead and add in our exports dot show here. And we'll make that an async function like so. Oh, I called the model action to show, but it's not. It's actually supposed to be find by ID. Sorry. The name of that is actually find by ID. I'll copy it again for you, but that's what it should be. Sorry about that. So the async action for the characters is going to take, it's going to take the request, because we have to this time, the response, and a next object, and I'll show you why we need the request. So the request is going to return back a parameter. Just like we did with React, we can actually pass parameters in our string list, and then we can listen for those parameters and do things based on them. We can do the same thing when it comes to sending them from here. So I want to capture the ID and then use the ID to do a lookup. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create
a variable called ID. Whoops. My cursor jumped. And then I'm going to say equals request.params. So the params object is where that ID is going to wind up getting stored on the request body .id. And now I have that ID stored in here. So request is this request that you see coming through. Params are any parameters that we have defined in our route, which we'll do next. And ID happens to be the bound parameter that we created, and that will be that value. The next thing I'm going to do is my character lookup. Whoops, don't want to capitalize that. I love this tab 9. It automatically fills in things for me. It's pretty cool. It's an extension that you can download, and they have a free version and a paid for version. Alright, so that will bring back the character for me. Only I've already broken my own rule. We need a try-catch around all of this. Let's be good little programmers. There we go. We need the try-catch because we don't have anything catching the error, and if we had the error, it would actually just execute and blow up, and we wouldn't know, well, we would know about it. Because our application would fail. And then we can just respond with a status of 200 and our character as JSON. So again, if I click send, nothing happens. And that's because even though I have the controller action defined, I still don't have the route set up. So I have the model now, I have the model action, I have the controller action, and now I need the route. And we're surprisingly very close to being done, which is really cool. But we have one more to set up after this. Alright, so let's move the character controller over here and finish off with our routes. So all we have to do first is add the new exported method to our index. So we're going to add show up here. And we can just literally Alt-Shift that down so that we have it here. And we need to define the path. So the way we do the path definition is the same way we did it in React, with a colon and ID. And then we need to change what particular action it's calling, and we're going to say call show. And now when you click send, you get your actual response back. So just to follow along again, inside our model, we have created a new method in here called findById. We have a path that we've set up that takes ID as an argument, right? So that we can actually go to the API and request a character based on its ID. The API will return it as an array, so we've destructured that array so that we get back only just the single object, right, for that character. And then we return that data. Very simple method. Not a lot going on in there. That goes to our controller, right, because we're importing our character. In our controller, we have gotten the ID that we bound, right, inside our routes here. We're getting that ID, we're storing it in a variable, and we're passing it as an argument to that function, to the method inside our model. That's going to return back a character for us, and then we're just passing the status of 200 and passing that character on as JSON. If an error happens, we call next error. And I think we could actually even throw that error if you wanted to see what it would look like. So if I just change that to characters and click send, we can see failed, characters is not defined, and then we get a big stack reference, which you can't really see. There we go. Yeah, there's more there, but you can't really see it because it's not letting me see it. Sometimes it takes a while for it to come back, probably because you guys are all hitting send at the same time. So it takes a second for it to come back. All right, one last action for us to initiate. So let's see if you guys have been paying attention. Where do I start? Do I start as a route? Do I start with the controller, or do I start with the model? Yep, we're going to start with the model. So this one's going to be a search action. So we'll just call it search, because I really don't know what else to call it by. Even though we're going to kind of have two going on there. So we'll do this as term, like so. All right, so this, we need our path, right? So let's set up our path. So this will be our base path with characters in it. And then this is where our term will go. Oh, sorry, there's one more to that. Search/term is the total path. This will give us our data back, which will be an array this time, which makes sense because our term will return back a list of characters that match that term. So we'll do await Axios and path. And then we will return the data. So once our model has been defined, where's the next spot that we should go write code? Yep, in our controller. That is correct. So we'll split our screen, close our model on this one, and go to our controllers. So right now we have index and show, and yeah, this feels a little weird to write exports .search, but sometimes you just have to call it the same thing. It's an async function, right? It takes a request, a response, and a next, and it takes the request on purpose because we need the parameter to look up. So this one is going to return a bunch of characters. So first we'll just do const term equals request.params.term, like so. I like to keep things named the same way. Like this doesn't have to be called term, but it makes more sense to keep everything the same way so you can match it all up when you're trying to crawl through somebody's code to figure out what they've done. So const characters, right? Plural, because we're going to return back a list of characters. This is going to return back character.search. And then this is where we're going to put our term. And then that is all going to go to status 200.json characters. And can somebody tell me what I've forgotten? What have I forgotten to do? Try catch. That's absolutely correct. I like that you senior-sized your answer. Try and catch. So when I was younger, I used to work for my uncle, and he was he owned an alarm company. So I did like alarm installations and stuff, and I did that for a bunch of years. Anyways, he thought when you were supposed to correspond with people through email that capital letters was conveyed professionalism. Like he honestly believed this, that like as long as you wrote everything in capitals, it conveyed professionalism. So all of his responses to every single person he ever corresponded with was written in capitals, and he still does it now, like 20 years later. Still types all in capital letters, every single thing he writes. And it's so funny because people take emotion from emails now because everybody communicates through text and through emails, and people have actually like chirped him in email, assuming he's yelling at them. Which is pretty funny. At least it's funny to me. Alright. Where are we going next? Get it? Next. Where are we going next? We're going to routes. Stella is 100% correct. We are going to routes. So in our routes, we're going to add a new route. So let's see. Can you walk me through this? How do I add that new search as a route? Let's see if you can figure this out. It's going to require a bit of thinking, right? Yeah, we're going to need a path. What's my path? Oh, nice. Very, very good. Characters, search, and term, right? What else do I need? Yeah, I need search, but where am I putting search first? Yes! Oh, Leo, nice. I'm going to put search here if my keyboard kicks back in. Don't tell me the batteries died. Here I am typing aimlessly. It would be nice if it gave you notice. And of course they're little batteries. Hold on. Really? I can't get at least like 2 seconds of juice out of you? Oh. Just 2 seconds of juice and then we're good. And then we'll add search here. Alright, that connects us up. We should be good. We should technically be able to execute inside our hopscotch. So let's go try. So instead of characters, we're going to do search slash and one of my personal favorite characters, which is the Hulk. Click send. And there we go. Look at that. I get back every character that begins with the word Hulk. And notice that it does give us images as well. You can get the images, but what's weird about it is it separates the extension. So you have to combine those if you want to be able to view the image. So that's pretty cool. So let's walk through that one more time just so we fully understand what's going on. We have our model. If it wants to drag. Drag. Why are you not dragging? Things are just not working. Alright, cool. There's our model. It's on this side here. Our model. Can I drag you over? Wow, everything's kind of like just glitched. Alright, so our model has 3 actions inside of it, or 3 helpers, right? We have a find method, we have a find by ID method, and we have a search method. Those methods return back various states of characters for us. Either it returns back the top 100, returns back a singular character for us based on their ID, or it returns back a list of characters based on a search term, right? All that is being retrieved from this Axios, using Axios from this HTTPS Marvel API wrapper API that was created. That's its whole purpose. It's just facilitating retrieving the data. That's its whole purpose for the model. Inside our character controller, we import our model and then we write actions that work with that model in order to facilitate getting the data that the user is looking for. The user executes a route which calls one of our controller actions, and our controller action facilitates retrieving the correct data from the database, formatting it in the format it needs to be formatted in, which is what we're doing with this JSON, and then responding with that information. So in index, we don't need a response here because we're not collecting any variables, or sorry, request, because we're not collecting any variables information. All we're doing is calling that wonderful find inside our model, and then responding with whatever gets returned. In our show, same kind of idea. We're going through the find by. However, this time we're grabbing our parameters, and our parameters come from these wonderful bound parameters that we define inside our paths. You guys that have done PHP, that should seem almost familiar because you do the same thing when you create SQL statements and you use bound parameters with PDO. It's exactly the same kind of concept. This is just a placeholder, and when somebody actually types in the URL, that placeholder gets filled with a value, and then you can use some sort of method to retrieve that value. So in this scenario, we use request.params.id to get that value. Then we have a character that we call this function, and it pulls back that one character from the Marvel API, and then we respond with that character's information. And then our search term, that's the last one. So we basically just run the search term. Just does it based on the first letters of the name. So if you were to type in like HU here and hit send, your list should be similar to the Hulk unless there's another character that doesn't start with that. Like human cannibal, right? Human fly, human robot, human torch. It'll return 100 character names that match those few letters, right? And their images and where they're from and stuff. That's about it for details on it, though. And yeah, if there any errors happen, we just catch it and we send them off with next. And that's everything. Is there any questions about today's class or today's lesson? So why don't we take a quick 2-second look at what we have entailed for next week. So next week, so that would be F20. Yes. So next week is when we start building our CRUD application. So we're going to introduce Mongoose and Mongo. And we're going to talk about ODMs, right? So object data mappers. And we're going to take a look intrinsically what that is. We're going to take a look at how to create a model schema and how to implement sanitization, normalization, and validation into our model. Then we're going to create a full REST API that allows us to perform create, read, update, and delete actions. And then we're going to test our API inside Hopscotch. Now, I believe the last time I ran this, it wound up, and there's a lab too, it wound up taking more than 1 week. I think it took a full 2 weeks to run. Yeah, because I wound up having to push everything along. So this is going to take almost 2 weeks. And then we're into authentication, which we'll do. This connecting React and Node together, I would like to do it, but it's tricky, and I might push it to the last little bit, where we have kind of 3 weeks available. Authentication is 2 weeks almost as well. And then we're into our final test after that. So there will be a project in there as well. The Node project will involve creating a CRUD API with authentication. It'll just be an API. If you want to connect it to a front end, that's a great way to get bonus marks, but the whole purpose will just be creating an API. And yeah, that's all I've got for you tonight. There's no tests, there's no quizzes or labs or anything, so I will do marking this weekend and mark all of your projects this weekend. I've had a few people still say that they didn't realize it was due. I don't know how, but if that's the case, get it in. I haven't marked it yet, so I don't even know you don't have it in yet, so get it in. All right, have a good night. No problem, Magnus. Have a good night.
Speaking out loud, when I'm actually just get back to it. When I try to go to the get for characters, it
Yeah.
just spits out 404.
So
It never even gives me a list of characters whatsoever.
you just get a 404? Okay, let me stop sharing my screen and then I'll get you to share your screen, Adam.
Yep.
Alright, go ahead.
Actually, the switch to the other longer because it's 1440p this one. Alright, should we work on that screen?
Yep, I can see it.
So it's just characters going directly to it.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got. Okay. So in your index.js, you're currently requiring your routes pages. You don't want to require your routes pages there. You just want to require the routes, just like that. There you go.
When I do that, then it said that the map's crashed.
Oh, show me. Cannot set headers after they've been sent to the client.
There you go.
Cannot find module routes pages under routes.js. So that error is actually coming from your routes.js file. So let's go take a look at your routes.js file and see why. So that's pages. I want routes.js.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, your root one.
Missed by one.
Routes pages router. So require routes pages with a G. Router. Is that not the same as mine? Routes pages. Oh, put a dot in front of those. So it's the problem is that it doesn't know where it is and it's trying to find the root to the file. So you need the dot for relative routes. So yeah, so save that. And
Yeah,
that should have corrected your error.
And then that throws it. Okay, it's just simple missing one character.
Yeah, so try and make sure your ID works. So give it one of the IDs and see if that works.
Missing 2 monitors makes this difficult. It's just throw an ID right off the back of this, right?
Yeah, I don't know what the IDs are though. Like they vary.
Okay.
Nope, we got a 404. Why did we get a
And this
404?
one's over here has been updated. Can't set headers.
After they are sent to the client. Course. Can you show me your index page? It might be the order that you have things in. No, that requires fine. That course is fine. Your routes are fine. Your error. Yeah. See where you have app.useCores on line 17? That needs to be like way up. No, sorry. Just get rid of line 17 because you already have it defined.
Oh yeah, that's because I think I was trying to fix one of the errors and I just copied a little bit but missed that it was.
Yeah. So course has to happen first because that's what sets the headers, and then what's happening is you're trying to output, and it's like, oh, dude, you've already sent headers. You can't do the output again, and then set headers. It doesn't let you do it. So yeah, if you try to send that request, it should work. So go back to Hopscotch and just send your request.
Yeah.
Did it go through?
Yep. 440.
Okay, so what's the error now? Let's go to your bash shell and see.
That's the thing. There's nothing. Didn't give me anything.
It's just giving a 404. Okay, so scroll up. So can I see what that path is inside Hopscotch? So under URL, what's your URL that you're looking at? Characters 1009144. Okay. Let's go see the routes characters.js. Let's see that. Because that's where we set those actual routes, and when we get those 404s, they're usually caused by the route missing. So, yeah, so you're missing a slash between characters and :ID, that's why.
Oh, okay.
So save that, and then rerun your Hopscotch. And there you go.
Missing 4 characters and messed it all up.
And your search one should work based on that. Based on looking at it, it should work. But go ahead and try it. So it's search and then slash whatever your term is.
Just keep it bad.
And that's working as well.
Thank you very much.
No problem, Adam. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.